The mountain night near the border was as cold as stone, sinking into the bone. Wind whipped across the ridges, howling through cracks in the rock, while faint beams from the distant military outpost flickered like fragile lifelines in the suffocating dark. Beyond the barbed wire fence, amidst a scatter of old wooden crates and scorched grass stained by sun and gunpowder, a small shadow moved, thin, silent like the breath of night itself. Reid Sloane sat on the concrete step in front of the barracks, his undershirt damp with sweat and desert dust. His eyes stayed fixed on a single black shape in the open yard, a pair of glowing eyes watching him. They didn't flinch, didn't retreat. They simply watched. As a Special Forces soldier, Reid had stared into countless eyes, of enemies, of dying comrades, of children dazed in the aftermath of explosions. But these eyes felt different. They gleamed not from reflected light, but from something deeper inside, something still burning. He didn't call out, didn't wave a scrap of food like the other soldiers might. He just sat there quietly, letting the shadow decide. And by the time his shift neared its end, as wind carried fine dust over the worn footpath, the dog stepped from the dark. Each step slow, legs trembling from hunger, fur matted with dried mud. It didn't howl, didn't growl. It simply stopped in front of Reid a few feet away and slowly sat down. "I don't give names to things that might leave," Reid murmured, squinting against the faded yellow light. "But you can stay." The next morning, the dog was still there, head resting against the step, eyes half-lidded as if it had never left, and when a slant of sunlight cut through the tin roof, its gaze shimmered again, like an old coin buried in dust, now turned to catch the sky. Reid reached for his canteen, leaned down, and brushed his fingers across the coarse fur tangled with dry leaves. "You shine like spare change in a poor man's pocket, you know," that he said, voice husky with a smile. "I'll call you Cash." Training a stray dog in a combat zone was never meant to be easy. Other canines were carefully selected and raised from birth through rigorous programs. But Cash came from a place without a name. No file, no history, and no one knew how many kicks he had survived before stepping into that base. Reid didn't care. The first week, Cash only watched. He didn't chase shadows or react to whistles. Every time Reid walked onto the training field, Cash followed at a distance, laying down silently, like he was measuring the man, weighing whether trust was worth giving. During attack drills, the other dogs lunged at dummies on command. Cash didn't budge no matter how many times Reid called. But the moment Reid turned to walk toward the equipment shed, Cash followed. Never close, never far, just enough to keep the man within sight. "You're more stubborn than Lieutenant Phillips," one young soldier joked. Watching Cash still seated by the pole, his eyes locked on Reid, speaking to a superior. Reid smiled, glanced over his shoulder. "He's not here to obey," he replied. "He just needs to know if there's someone worth following." Their first scent drill took place under the blazing sun. The entire field reeked of dust and sweat. Other dogs quickly found the scent-laced cloth hidden beneath crates. Cash stood still, head low, ears pricked, but unmoving. Reid didn't issue a command. He simply sat, one hand resting on his knee, eyes steady on the dog. 10 seconds, 20, 30. Cash moved. Slowly, deliberately, he walked toward the northern fence, toward a narrow vent just wide enough for a cloth to be tucked inside. His nose dipped once, twice. Then he took the cloth gently in his jaws and returned. No leaping, no bark of triumph, just a quiet delivery. Reid accepted it. Good. It was the first time he had said that word to Cash. And for the first time, Cash stepped closer, laid his head on Reid's knee, and remained still, like he had found the one place where he belonged. That night, Reid returned to the barracks. Cash followed. Same distance, same silent steps. Each night brought the same ritual. Cash lay by the door facing outward, head turned in. Not fully asleep, not standing guard like a trained warrior, but resting like a creature who had finally found one place in the world it trusted. Reid wrote in his notebook, "I never told him to stay. But maybe. Some things don't need orders to be loyal." And when dawn broke, dew still glistening on the concrete floor, Cash was still there. Eyes open, gaze unchanged since that first night, quiet deep, shining like an old coin that never lost its worth. Cash. A name not meant for calling, but for holding on to something that once seemed lost in the fog. Gunfire never smelled like victory. It reeked of burning rubber, old gasoline-rusted metal, and that warm scent no one ever wanted to name. The trace of blood on the sand. This was the western edge where Reid's unit was sent for a fast, clean strike. Just a 2-hour mission, but enough to turn the ground into a maze of dust and bullets. Cash came along. Not as an official K-9 unit, but as the silent shadow of the soldier who had given him a name. His dark coat blended into the sun-scorched dirt, but his eyes never left Reid. Not for a second since the chopper touched down. Reid didn't use a leash. "He knows who to follow," he told the commander when asked about protocol. The other soldiers chuckled. A stray, no matter how trained, was still just a stray to them. But then the moment came. The team broke into an abandoned supply depot, splitting into 2 directions. Reid led the left flank with 2 younger soldiers. From the north, a blast echoed, small but sharp enough to throw red dust into the air. The rear building trembled. Seconds later, radio contact with the left group went silent. Reid vanished into the rising haze of smoke. Cash let out a low growl, ears pricked, eyes scanning the haze as if a dormant instinct had been reignited. A soldier reached to pull him back, but in the blink of an eye, Cash broke formation, darting into the smoke, charging in a direction no one else had seen. No radio signal, no command. But he moved with certainty, as if the invisible thread tying him to Reid had never once frayed. On the far side of the collapsed wall, Reid lay on his side, his shoulder crushed against a twisted frame of steel, a long gash trailing blood from his temple to the collar of his shirt. He was still breathing, but the ringing in his ears blurred the world around him. Through the swirling dust, the first thing he saw wasn't the rescue team. It was a pair of dark, amber eyes. Silent. Unshaken. Cash. No barking. No panic. Cash approached with a calm that betrayed the chaos he'd run through. He pressed his nose gently to Reid's hand, checking each breath. Then he turned, lifted his head, and howled. A short, sharp cry that cut through the smoke like a beacon for the team still searching. 12 minutes later, the rescue unit reached them both. Reid was lifted out with a harness, while Cash looped behind, finding his own way out. Never too close to be in the way. Never too far to lose sight of the man he had come for. "I didn't give any orders," Reid said later in his mission report voice, even spare. "He came back on his own?" the commander asked, still holding a file smudged with red dust. Reid gave a quiet nod. "He doesn't need his name called. He just needs to know who's waiting." There were no further questions. That night, electricity came late to the barracks. A small corner had been set aside for Cash. A simple rug laid out on the tile, a metal bowl filled with water. But Cash didn't lie there. He curled beside Reid's bedhead, resting at the foot of the chair, breathing softly, as if that alone was enough to keep watch over someone who had just returned from the edge. Reid sat by the window, watching moonlight spill across the concrete floor, and wrote a few lines into the weathered notebook by his side. When no one remembered the way back, he found me. Not because of command, not because of training, only because he is Cash. The next day, the Special Ops team entered a simulated emergency drill. Cash stood beside Reid. No leash, no standard issue K-9 vest. Each time Reid moved, Cash adjusted without prompt. When Reid paused, so did he. When Reid shifted left, Cash didn't hesitate. Soon the entire squad began to notice. Not because Cash was the most obedient, but because since that mission, he had never once let Reid out of his sight. At the evening debrief, the commander summed it up plainly. Cash doesn't need to prove anything. He doesn't obey. He accompanies. The words carried through the base like quiet recognition. As night fell and the lights dimmed, the base returned to its usual rhythm of crickets and wind. Reid sat alone on the front step, legs stretched out, a warm cup in hand. Cash lay beside him, head on Reid's thigh, eyes half closed, at home in the silence. "You afraid of anything?" Reid asked, not really expecting an answer. Cash shifted slightly, just enough for his weight to settle more firmly into Reid's lap. Somewhere in the darkness, a dry leaf skittered off the tin roof and vanished. Reid followed it with his eyes, then let out a long breath. "Next time, don't go ahead," he whispered. "Stay beside me. You know how." Cash didn't move, just thumped his tail once against the cement. Just enough to say, "I'm here, waiting for you to come back." Time in the military isn't counted by seasons or years, but by returns, and those who didn't make it back. 4 years had passed since Cash first arrived at the base with Reid. He had grown into a solid frame, his dark coat sleek, his gait steady, quiet like he belonged in the formation. Without rank, but always accounted for in every deployment plan. Around the camp, people had given him names that weren't official, but felt truer than any ID tag, Reid's Shadow, the Morning Watch, and sometimes the Living Hunch. No one remembered when the habit started. They just knew that whenever Reid sat silently at the strategy table, massaging his temple or staring far into space, Cash, no matter where he was, would walk over and gently tap Reid's leg. No claws, no pain, just a single soft touch, as if to say, "I'm here." Then he'd sit or lie down nearby doing nothing more. No one taught him that. No one commanded it. But Reid felt it. Each time the tangle in his thoughts seemed to ease. One deeper breath, one dim corner of memory quietly illuminated. Once during a strategy meeting, Reid stopped mid-sentence. The room fell silent. Cash stood by the door unseen until then. He walked over, tapped Reid's leg once, and waited. Reid nodded gently and resumed speaking. No one asked why. They all just exchanged a quiet smile, as if they'd witnessed a signal only hearts could understand. Cash had never gone through standard training, but his instinct responded to unease faster than radar. Before major operations, when no one sensed danger, yet Cash would silently patrol the perimeter, ears twitching, nose close to the ground, as if rereading details humans had missed. More than once, because of Cash's unexplained tension, the unit had altered their routes and avoided ambushes. One scout once joked, "I trust Cash more than the satellite map." During a hostage rescue at the southern border, Cash, without a word, dashed between 2 massive boulders and barked once sharp and loud. When the team followed, they found a hidden path leading to an underground shelter, where 2 bound captives were held. No voices, no signs, just Cash, who had known all along. From that day on, every time before deployment, the commanding officer followed a simple ritual. He reached back, touched Cash's head like consulting a living compass, and only then gave the order to move out. Some nights, Reid woke suddenly, cold sweat clinging to the back of his neck. He didn't turn on the light, just sat up in bed, back against the wall, his hand resting on the faded scar along his left side, where a shard of steel had once nearly taken his life. Soft footsteps echoed. Cash stepped out of the shadows, asking no questions, needing no name called. He came close, paused beside Reid's leg, then gently scratched. Just once. The clock read 3:17 a.m. Reid exhaled a short breath, like a man who'd just been pulled back from the edge of something deep and dark. He reached down, ran a hand over Cash's head. "Do you dream too, huh?" Cash rested his muzzle on Reid's thigh, eyes slowly closing. No answer needed. His presence was already a complete reply. In the barracks, a photograph hung on the corkboard. Behind the training room, the entire unit gathered after a successful mission. In the center, Reid crouched, arm resting on one knee, face streaked with dust, gaze sharp as drawn steel. Beside him, Cash sat upright, ears perked, eyes not toward the lens, but fixed to the left where a helicopter had just touched down. "He doesn't pose," Reid had once said with a grin. "He's on duty." That line became something of a motto whenever someone asked why Cash wasn't like other canines. Why he didn't react to alarms, didn't lunge at training targets, didn't flinch at simulated explosions. Cash worked by instinct, and a kind of unwavering trust that belonged to one person only. One afternoon, light rain fell without warning. The base had no shelter wide enough, so the team gathered under a narrow awning outside the armory. Reid sat on the ground, back against a metal pole staring off into the distance. Cash stood in the rain, drenched fur clinging to his sides, but unmoving. Reid gestured. "Come here." Cash didn't move right away. He looked at Reid for 2 long seconds, then slowly walked over. He stopped in front of him and quietly scratched at Reid's leg. Everyone laughed. A young soldier joked, "That's how Cash checks if you're drifting too far into your head." Reid just nodded and patted his thigh. Cash sat down and together they watched the gray sky. The rain didn't blur anything. It made the things that truly mattered clearer. That morning Reid packed more lightly than usual. No tactical bag, no armor, no parting slogans. It was so quiet that Cash stood watching him for 10 full minutes without moving, like he was waiting for the familiar cue that never came. Reid turned, crouched down, and placed a hand on the neck of the dog that had walked beside him through deserts, fire zones, and borderlands. "We're leaving," he said softly, his eyes catching a beam of sun through the doorframe. "This time, it's somewhere else." 3 months earlier, Reid had stepped away from the Special Forces unit, transferred into a civilian tactical task force. The paperwork called it a strategic reassignment. But those who had served with him knew. After years of smoke and shadows, Reid needed something more than tactics. He needed to choose his battles and bring light into places where the law often failed to reach. His new mission placed him near the Colorado border, a region marked on maps as rural community but known off-record as a vital artery in a cross-border trafficking network. Intelligence reports hinted that the missing, women, children, entire families, were not a matter of coincidence. Someone was organizing, operating, hiding in the dark. Reid had been assigned to lead an independent infiltration group. No uniform, no badge, no safety net. But he brought something that reports didn't account for Cash. "You're sure?" his former commander asked, casting a concerned glance at the familiar dark shape beside Reid in that final briefing. "I'm sure," Reid said simply. "This time he's not coming as a soldier. He's coming as a friend." The road west was coated in dust and sun. Scattered wooden homes sat among sunburnt pine. When the truck slowed at an abandoned checkpoint, Cash immediately perked up, front paws on the door nose pressed against the glass as if mapping the terrain by instinct. Reid watched the behavior with a faint smile. "You remember, don't you? That scent. The kind no map has ever written down." They made camp in a house left behind after last year's wildfire. Burned floorboards, windows thick with ash, but perfectly positioned to watch over 2 trails cutting through the trees. At night, Cash stood by the door, not looking into the woods, but back inside, where Reid pored over files, marked maps, studied every line of a survivor's report. Between them, there were no commands, only understanding. Whenever Reid stopped writing, Cash would step over and gently scratch at the leg of his chair, as if to remind him, You're still breathing. We're still searching. One chilly morning frost clinging to the treetops, Reid received a call from a Mexican woman, someone who had escaped a trafficking ring 3 years earlier and now lived in a town near the border. Her voice trembled. "I heard the horn again," she said. "That horn. 2 short bursts. They always used it when they moved people. I'm sure someone was taken last night." Reid took down the location. No weapon check. He looked over at Cash, sitting by the door, head tilted, ears sharply raised. "Want to go?" Reid asked gently. Cash didn't answer. He simply rose, turned toward the door, like he had so many times before, only this time no order was spoken. On the way toward the town's edge, they crossed an old wooden bridge. Wind slipped through peeling railings, whistling like unfinished conversations. Reid pulled over onto the grassy shoulder, unfolded a map, and marked a fresh point, the location of the sound she'd reported. While he worked, Cash hopped out, circling the vehicle nose to the ground. Then he looked up, eyes fixed on a warehouse complex beyond a chain-link fence long abandoned but recently locked tight. There, Reid asked, stepping out and giving Cash a pat between the shoulders. "Let's go have a look." As they stepped through the rotting wooden gate, Reid carried no firearm, just a folding knife tucked into his shirt pocket. He didn't need more. Not here. In this place, real weapons weren't made of steel. They were the eyes that saw what others missed, and the instincts that knew, before anything even happened. Cash moved slowly and silently, weaving through the grass, his body lowered, guided by something deeper than sight. A dormant instinct steering him forward. Inside the warehouse, the only light came from a broken patch in the roof, filtering down over rusted metal crates. And then, a sound. A dragging noise. The faint scrape of a chain against concrete. Cash froze. His whole body tightened. Ears high. Reid raised one hand, the same signal he'd used for 4 years. Cash understood. He pressed himself flat against the wall, eyes locked on the darkness ahead. It could have been a holding place. It could have been a trap. They hadn't crossed the threshold yet, but in that moment Reid understood something clearly. This wasn't a mission anymore. It was the final return toward the truth. That night they returned to the burned-out cabin under cover of darkness. No gunfire, no injuries. Just one more red mark on the map, where the tire tracks had worn thin and a trail of dried blood clung to aged concrete. They hadn't reached the heart of the trafficking ring, but they were closer. Reid sat on the porch step, eyes resting on the tree line. Cash lay beside him, head on his lap. No words passed between them. But something was understood in this fight. They were no longer just soldier and K9. They were 2 friends, reclaiming what was right. Morning at the border station began with a routine systems check, like so many others. The sun had yet to rise above the ridgeline, casting a pale copper hue across the dew. At 0617, the tech crew arrived with tracking gear and infrared maps, aiming to retrieve signals from the western forest, where Reid had last marked coordinates before vanishing from the system. No radio transmissions, no GPS coordinates. Not a single signal had been received from Reid's body-worn device in over 10 hours. The signal tower sat on a slope, a compact steel hub critical to receiving data from independent field teams. Its antenna stood rigid among sunburnt weeds with no sign of tampering. But the control panel was dark. The lead technician tried rebooting the interface. Nothing. Another removed the power unit and inspected the internals. No damaged cables, backup batteries still intact. Everything was in place. Except for one thing, Reid was gone. Cash had arrived with the technical crew. As soon as the vehicle stopped, he stepped down on his own. tail low, body tense, gaze fixed on a patch of brush 20 meters out. It looked like nothing. But minutes later, Cash began to react. It started with a low growl, a deep rumble, not a warning but something from within vibrating like a struck wire. He began circling the station, slow steps, nose close to the dirt, occasionally lifting his head to look in the same direction, where the forest edge met a sunken slope. A soldier stepped close and laid a hand gently on Cash's back, trying to calm him. But the dog flinched, turned sharply, his eyes sharp, body taut like a wire about to snap. He wouldn't leave, wouldn't respond. He kept circling, over and over, like he was drawing something that no one else could see. "What's wrong with your dog?" one of the younger soldiers asked, half curious, half concerned. "Nothing's wrong with him," the team lead replied. "Something's wrong out here." Inside the control station, the screens still blinked with connection errors. No message had been sent from Reid's device since the previous night. The exact moment of signal loss matched a burst of interference, just under 90 seconds long, enough to shut every channel down, as if someone had known exactly how to sever the link, without leaving a trace. Cash remained at the edge of the forest, where the ground was cracked and the grass sparse. He sat there staring into what seemed like nothing. He didn't howl, didn't dig, but his nails were turning red from constant pacing. A gust of wind swept through, carrying dust and the faint smell of burnt plastic. Cash sniffed, body crouched, ready to launch forward. But Reid still hadn't returned. At 10:52, the tech team decided to access backup satellite logs, hoping to reconstruct Reid's last few hours. The result appeared on screen: a broken trail of red dots scattered from the southern valley toward the forest edge. The final point lay precisely where Cash was now staring. The silence in the room tightened. "That's no coincidence," someone muttered. The last ping, and Cash's reaction. It's like he knows. The officer at the window stared out toward the dog, its dark gray coat glowing slightly in the morning sun, unmoving like a statue carved from loyalty. "Call in more men," he said quietly. "Form a search grid around that area. Start now." As the team mobilized toward the forest, Cash rose first. As if finally permitted to move, he stepped forward, steady and low, ears tuned to every flicker of sound in the air. A soldier walking just behind whispered, "He's not looking for someone. He's bringing someone home." And it was true. Cash wasn't searching. He was tracing. Every pause, every turn, the shift to the left, where a narrow trail dipped into soft dirt. It all felt like he was walking someone else's path backward. His paws pressed into the fractured soil like he was reading the pages of a story never told. Roughly 400 meters in, they reached a shallow basin. The earth had sunk slightly, as if under some recent pressure. Not enough to raise alarms, but just enough to bury something beneath. Cash stopped, leaned forward, then turned to the team behind him. That look, it was the one he only gave when he was certain. No doubt. "Start digging here," the commander said. "There might be someone under there." The signal tower still wasn't working. Reid hadn't been found. But now, they had a reason to believe. Not because of the systems, not because of the maps, but because a dog still believed his friend was waiting to be found, if someone would just be patient enough to follow him. The sunken stretch of land lay near an old quarry, abandoned nearly a decade ago. Once a site for sandstone extraction, it had long since turned into a dumping ground for defunct construction equipment, then forgotten beneath time and creeping weeds. The ground there was soft, dry, unstable. One wrong pressure point was enough to hollow out the earth beneath it. Cash led the search team to that spot at high noon beneath searing heat and gusts of hot wind. But he didn't slow down. On the contrary, when he reached within 10 meters of the basin's rim, he suddenly accelerated. bounding over patches of dry grass, then stopped dead in his tracks. His nose touched the dirt. His body crouched low, eyes narrowed in intense focus as if channeling every part of his being to confirm something very precise. Seconds later, Cash began to dig. At first his paws struck hard. Dirt flew in bursts. Sand and stone clung to his dark fur as he clawed into the brittle ground. But Cash didn't stop. Before the team could even reach him, he let out a soft growl deep in his throat and dug harder, like something beneath the surface was calling him now. "Stop him!" a soldier cried, alarmed at the unstable terrain. "Wait!" the commander raised his hand, eyes locked on the dog's behavior. "He's leading us to something." And then, blood began to show on Cash's paw. His front left nail had torn free. A deep gash ran along the pad, leaking red onto the soil. But still he dug, faster, more desperate, like time itself was running out beneath his feet. A sound rang out. At first it was faint, like a soft tap of metal against steel. One soldier thought he imagined it. But then it came again, gentle, rhythmic, from beneath the ground. "I hear it," someone gasped. "There's someone down there. It's knocking." The team rushed in, shovels, picks, bare hands, anything they could use. Cash pulled back, panting, hard, blood pooling beneath him. But his eyes never left the spot he had clawed open, the place where the knocking continued like a heartbeat, asking not to be forgotten. Reid, the commander, yelled, voice cracking. "If you can hear us, knock 3 times. Silence." Then clang, 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 3 knocks. Clear, deliberate. A roar broke through the group. Shouts, choked cries, the sound of relief bursting after 10 hours of dread. Reid was alive, buried beneath earth and silence, cut off from every signal. But alive, still strong enough to knock from within the steel barrier that might have become his grave, if not for the dog, who never believed he was gone. After nearly an hour of digging, the final layer of soil was cleared. A small vent shaft appeared, just wide enough for an air tube and water line. A rescue team from the nearest town was deployed to widen the opening. Plank by plank, sheet by sheet, they dismantled the underground structure. And when the main hatch was finally forced open, the first to peer inside wasn't a medic. It was Cash. Despite the wound, he leapt into the narrow space before anyone could stop him. And under the dim beam of headlamps, a breath-stealing sight emerged. Reid sat slumped against the wall shirt, torn skin coated in dust and dried blood, eyes half closed. When the light touched him, he blinked. Slowly, his fading gaze found Cash, and a faint smile flickered across his lips. "You found me, huh?" Reid whispered, voice like wind from another world. Cash didn't bark, didn't pounce in joy. He simply walked forward, laid his head on Reid's knee, and exhaled. And for that moment, everything stopped. No shouting, no orders, no movement. No one dared interrupt the reunion of 2 souls who had found each other across the veil of death. As Reid was lifted to the surface, the entire team gathered around the stretcher. Cash walked beside him, slow, limping on a torn paw, but never more than a step away. He didn't need a leash. As long as Reid was breathing, then anywhere could be the way home. A vet approached, ready to tend to Cash's injuries. The dog looked up. No growl, no warning, but didn't budge. His eyes said it all. "Not yet. Let me bring him back first." When the evacuation chopper rose from the basin, Cash lay beside the stretcher, his head resting on Reid's leg, eyes closed. The rotor's wind lifted dust from his fur, dust soaked with blood, sweat, and an unbreakable will. Inside the cabin, Reid stirred once more. He couldn't speak, but he reached out, fingers brushing the thick fur at Cash's neck. What he touched was warm, familiar, and alive. A quiet miracle after so many hours of absence. When the ambulance touched down at the field hospital's concrete pad, it felt, for a moment, like the worst was over. Reid was rushed into recovery, heartbeat steady, blood pressure low but responsive. The medical team moved fast. IVs, antiseptics, a brace for his dislocated wrist. Under cold fluorescent lights, the mission seemed finished. But Cash wasn't there. No one could pinpoint the moment he slipped away. A nurse remembered seeing him at the door. A soldier thought he'd been lying by the bench, head lowered. But before anyone had tended to the deep gash on his side, he was gone, vanished as quietly as he had come. The late afternoon wind swept along the old ridge, carrying the scent of scorched plastic and stone. The sky turned the color of tarnished copper. Birds circled low over the forest edge, and from the basin, once a shallow grave, now a place reclaimed, Cash returned. No call, no handler, just blood-stained paws following instinct, back to where he had dug, because beneath the dirt, something was still unfinished. When the recon team found him again, he was near a narrow crevice behind the quarry. A crack in the rock too small for a man to enter, but deep enough to conceal a body, or a flicker of life about to go out. A soldier shouted when he noticed the deep red staining Cash's side. Blood had soaked through his fur and was dripping onto the stone floor. But the dog didn't stop. He pushed his head into the crevice, half his body disappearing into the rock. "Pull him back," someone yelled. Too late, the commander snapped. "Fall back. Let him do what he came to do." Inside the narrow crack was a hollowed-out pocket, scattered with broken boards, rope remnants, and boot prints still fresh in the dirt. A man lay on his side, face down, his wrists bound with worn-out duct tape. His breathing was shallow, one cheek swollen with bruises, shoulder scraped raw. It was the missing liaison, gone for 4 days. Cash moved slowly, deliberately, careful not to disturb the air. He tilted his head, sniffed, found the breath. Then he reached down, teeth grasping the edge of the man's shirt, and pulled, inch by inch. He couldn't rely on strength alone. Cash shifted positions, looped behind the man, braced his shoulder and pushed, then pulled, then pushed again as if trying to raise a life from the ground. Outside, the rescue team heard the scuffling, the sound of loose stone sliding. One soldier pressed close to the gap flashlight, angled in. "There's someone in there," he cried. "Cash is with him." 2 others dropped to the ground, crawling in. A compact rescue stretcher was slid through, and then a hand emerged. Bloodied, but moving. Cheers erupted like thunder as the man was pulled free, coughing hard as air filled his lungs. Again, Cash didn't follow. A soldier leaned in, calling softly. "Cash, come on, buddy, you did it." No response. He aimed his flashlight and saw Cash lying on his side, breathing heavily. Blood had soaked through his flank, turning the dust beneath him dark red. "God!" "It's everywhere," the soldier whispered. 2 men crawled in at once, one with a light, the other reaching under the dog's belly. Cash whimpered faintly. His body was heavy, not from weight, but from exhaustion, pressing on every breath. "We're not leaving him," the commander ordered into his radio. "I don't care what it takes. Get Cash out." They wrapped him in a rescue blanket, lifting him as gently as if he were a fallen brother. When the stretcher surfaced from the pit, the entire team stepped back, not out of fear of the blood, but out of reverence for the silence that surrounded this dog, as if something sacred had touched the ground. Reid woke briefly beneath the haze of sedation. His eyes hadn't yet opened, but his lips moved. "Cash." Before the doctor could answer, the emergency room door burst open. A soldier stepped inside, face streaked with dirt and sweat. "Sir, you should know. Cash," went back into the quarry. Reid's chest tightened. His voice caught in his throat. "He saved another man." the soldier continued softly. And he's being brought in now. He's on the stretcher next to you. 2 stretchers side by side. 1 man, 1 dog. No one spoke. Reid turned his head. His left hand, still hooked to an IV, trembled as he reached. A nurse gently guided it toward Cash's back. Still warm. Still pulsing. Barely. Cash opened his eyes. Just slightly. But enough. Enough to find Reid's gaze. Enough to let go. He dug with a torn paw, bit the shirt, pushed the man up himself, one responder wrote in the report. No orders, the officer asked. None came the answer. From the beginning, he wasn't following commands. He was holding on to what he believed was right. The field hospital sat in a quiet basin, hugged by long shadows of pine trees and the fading light of day. No sirens, no loudspeakers, just the rhythmic beeping of machines measuring time in heartbeats. From bed 3, Reid lay unmoving, wrapped in gauze and tubing, his body gaunt and bruised. Not an arm's length away, Cash was curled up, head resting near Reid's bed. No one told him to be there, and no one dared ask him to leave. A thin blanket had been laid beneath him, a quiet gesture that this space belonged to him. But even without it, Cash would have stayed. Since the moment he was pulled from the quarry, he hadn't left Reid's side. A veterinarian had tried to examine him, and just touching the blood-soaked fur made them frown. We need to move him to a veterinary surgical center, they said. No, the commander replied, eyes locked on the ultrasound screen. If we separate them now, he'll let himself die. Reid slipped into a temporary coma, dehydration, blood loss, and systemic collapse. The heart monitor kept its beat, steady, sometimes skipping, like a man lost in a dream, gasping for air in his sleep. Cash didn't sleep. Though his body trembled from pain and fever, his eyes remained open, watching Reid, as if counting every breath to make sure his friend was still here. A young nurse walked in, stopped at the door, and simply stared. It's like he's guarding his soul, she whispered. By midnight, the temperature dropped. Cash's breathing grew shallow. The vet returned. This time, they didn't check for blood. They brought the ultrasound. The screen lit up with a shadow, a dark pool beneath the diaphragm. Internal bleeding. The tear in his side. It's deeper than we thought, the doctor murmured. Could be the liver or spleen. The assistant's eyes dimmed. If we don't operate, we might not have more than a few hours. A heavy silence blanketed the room. No one spoke. But Cash stayed. Whether he understood or not, perhaps he understood more than anyone. He remained, eyes glowing with something beyond instinct, not survival, a final plea to stay just a little longer. At 3:42 a.m., Reid's body jolted slightly. The heart monitor blared twice in alarm. A doctor rushed in, adjusting the IVs. Reid's system reacted slowly, pulse, weak pressure dropping below safety thresholds. Cash raised his head. His ears twitched. Then he stood, wobbling. One paw curled beneath him, but he moved just once. Stepping closer to the edge of Reid's bed, he leaned forward and touched Reid's hand with his nose. Just a breath of contact. The heart monitor paused, just for a second. Then it resumed. The doctor didn't notice, but the nurse at the far end of the room had tears streaming down her cheeks. I think he's holding him here, she whispered. Near dawn, Reid stirred. His eyelids fluttered, then opened, clouded like he was seeing through fog. He couldn't speak, couldn't move. But in his eyes, there was memory. Cash lay close to the bed, then his body nearly unraveling. The vessels beneath his fur had dulled to faint threads, dried blood crusted like hardened soil over a flame struggling to stay lit. But the moment Reid opened his eyes, Cash blinked, slowly, for the first time in nearly a day. Cash. Reid rasped each syllable pulled from the farthest corner of his chest. His hand trembling reached out, fingertips grazing the dog's ear. Cash gently pressed his nose into the center of Reid's palm, a single touch between two heartbeats, one fading, one returning. The doctor approached, laying a steady hand on Reid's shoulder. "You need to rest. You're going to be all right. But your friend? He's fading by the minute." Reid nodded slightly, lips barely parting. "Don't take him away, no matter what. Don't leave him alone." The doctor glanced at him, then over to Cash. Breathing faintly, but eyes still open, fixed on the ceiling, as if willing himself to stay conscious. Just long enough to witness something final. From that point on, no one spoke of moving Cash. A small cot was placed beside Reid's bed, just enough for two lives to lie quietly side by side. No one called it a miracle. But in that small room between two shortening heartbeats, there was a silent vow: as long as we breathe, we don't leave. Soft morning sunlight filtered through the dusty window, casting a gentle glow over the ashen-gray blanket. The medical room remained hushed like the night before, yet the numbers on Reid's monitor had begun to climb, slowly, rhythmically. The first sign of a body making its way back from the edge. Reid regained full consciousness at 06:12. His eyes opened slowly, as though his lids were heavier than the rest of him. A deep breath swelled in his chest, no longer trapped beneath sharp pain. No ventilator, no sedation, just him and a quiet world growing lighter around him. He turned his eyes. On his right, a small table, a few scattered medical files. On his left, Cash. The dog was curled up, his head resting near the edge of the bed. His chest rose and fell, barely perceptible. No sound, no reaction. Just those eyes still open, blinking once. Reid moved his hand beneath the blanket, searching for something familiar. His fingers brushed warm fur. Cash didn't lift his head, didn't lick his hand like he once did. He simply lay there, eyes distant like drifting in the last edge of a dream. Reid shifted, straining against pain, and turned toward his dog. "I'm awake now," he whispered, his voice dry but full. Cash didn't bark, didn't move. He just blinked, one more time. A doctor on duty stepped in, seeing Reid alert. Relief softened his face. He placed a hand over the heart monitor. "Good morning, Captain Reid," he said gently, afraid to disturb something fragile. "You're back." Reid didn't look away from Cash. "How is he?" The doctor hesitated, then exhaled. "Still here, but only by instinct." Reid closed his eyes a moment, then opened them again. "I want to stay like this. Don't touch him. Let him be." The doctor nodded. He understood. Everyone did. For two souls who had crossed fire and silence together, healing wasn't the most precious thing. Presence was. The sun climbed higher. Light fell across Reid's face, tracing the bridge of his nose and the gauze on his brow. A breeze slipped through the window, stirring the curtains, like the room itself was breathing. Reid breathed steadily, and Cash still breathed. One, returning from death. The other, quietly stepping back, one breath at a time. No one spoke. That room in that hour was a place of two lives, parallel opposite, but bound together like the final note in a fading song. A nurse changed the IV bag, casting a glance toward Cash. "He hasn't closed his eyes since last night." "He's not ready," Reid murmured. "He's watching over me. When I'm strong enough, he'll let go. The doctor placed a hand on Reid's shoulder. You're still weak, but with a heart rhythm like this, I think Cash knows you're safe now. Reid turned to the dog. Despite the blur of exhaustion, he could still make out the dried blood on his coat, the old wound still red along his side. Cash blinked slowly. No reflex left, only the soft, resigned light of peace. Stay a little longer, would you? Reid whispered, fingers reaching gently to scratch behind his friend's ear. Give me just a few more minutes to remember why I'm still here. Cash didn't answer, but his chest continued to rise and fall, steady, calm. By noon, the doctor returned. He checked both patients, this time in silence. Reid was gaunt, but his vitals had stabilized. Cash. His body temperature had fallen below safety and neurological responses were nearly gone. And still, his heart hadn't stopped. I've never seen anything like it, the doctor said to the nurse. He's alive on something, beyond biology. Maybe loyalty, the nurse offered, her eyes wet. Maybe, the doctor whispered. Or friendship, at a depth we're still learning how to measure. That afternoon, Reid was able to sit up. He leaned toward Cash, gently parting the fur on his neck, where the scar from their very first mission still remained. From that day to this one, he whispered, you've always found your way back. Cash exhaled. Didn't stir. As if saving his final breath. To listen, Reid bent forward, his lips brushing the crown of Cash's head. You don't have to hold on anymore. I remember the way now. Outside the window, the sky turned amber. A sunbeam slanted across Cash's cot. Bright and warm, like a path opened just for a soul that had kept its promise. In silence. The field hospital's evacuation began as expected. Folders packed lines, disconnected triage codes issued for transport. The room buzzed with urgency. But 2 beds were untouched. One held Reid, recovering awake, still tethered to tubes, and the other held Cash. Reid was fully conscious now, though weak. He could take small spoonfuls of broth, speak in soft fragments. And the first thing he asked was, is he still here? The answer was yes. Cash was still there, his eyes half closed, body nearly spent. Yet every time Reid turned his head, Cash's ears would twitch, just slightly, as if some invisible thread still linked them. A thread even the strongest painkillers couldn't sever. When the ambulance arrived, the medical team began moving patients. Reid was prioritized. Complex injuries in need of advanced care. A nurse approached Cash's bed, preparing to check the old wound, then paused. He's trembling. Not from cold, not from pain, but because Reid's gurney was being wheeled away. Hold on, the doctor said, eyes flicking to the ultrasound monitor. Let's see what he does. As Reid reached the doorway, Cash lifted his head. His eyes widened, breathing quickened, muscles tensed beneath his fur as if ready to stand, despite a hind leg still bleeding. No one called him. No one ordered anything. But somehow Cash understood Reid was leaving this room. He forced himself up, front paws pressing into the mattress, head raised high. His hind legs trembled. Blood from the wound at his side began soaking the sheets. But Cash didn't whimper, didn't howl. He stood. One step, then another. Reid heard the soft scratch of claws on the floor and turned his head. And in that moment their eyes met. Cash's gaze held no fear, no blame. Only a plea, don't leave me behind. The nurse waved to the gurney team. We're taking them both, together. Does Cash need to be transferred? Someone asked. Medically, he should stay, the vet replied. But psychologically, separating them now would cut the only thread keeping him alive. The commander nodded without hesitation. Put the beds side by side. Cancel whatever you have to. Let Cash see his partner is still near. A special ambulance was prepared for the two. On one side, Reid's stretcher, fluid stable vitals holding. On the other, a smaller bed layered in thick blankets cradling Cash's body, still damp with sweat and blood. No one wrapped him tighter. No one forced meds. Only two things were held firmly in place: the distance between their beds and the line of sight between them. For the entire 40-minute ride to the hospital, there was no barking, no voices, only the soft beep of heart monitors, and two steady breaths, rising and falling in tandem. A nurse sat between them, eyes fixed on Cash. She saw every small ripple of his abdomen when Reid shifted, every twitch of his ear when the monitor on Reid's side skipped a beat, then resumed. "I've never seen love this quiet," she whispered. "This isn't love," the doctor replied gently. "It's connection. And when something's bound by life itself, words aren't needed." At the main hospital, they were brought into a shared critical care room. The supervising physician initially protested. No animals in sterile zones. But then he read the note, "Critical bonded case, high risk of death upon separation." He looked up, stunned. "I've never seen that written. But I believe it." 2 beds, 1 room. Reid was reattached to monitoring devices, given more antibiotics. Cash received hydration, a small oxygen tube placed beneath his nose. Every piece of equipment was minimized to preserve the space between their 2 beds. When the lights dimmed, Reid opened his eyes again. He saw Cash lying there, head turned ever so slightly toward him. The dog's eyes no longer shone, but they were open, still watching. "You're still holding on for me," Reid whispered. "But I'm here now. I'm safe. You can rest if you're tired." Cash blinked, slowly. No movement, no response. Only that gaze which now seemed to say, "I don't know how to let go. I only know how to stay." The sterile white room no longer reeked of antiseptics. The rhythmic beeps of the machines no longer startled anyone. They had become a backdrop for a goodbye that hadn't yet arrived. Reid woke again around 5 a.m. No dreams, no alarms, just a sudden warmth in his open palm. He turned his head. Cash was still there, lying still facing him, eyes slightly open. But this time there was no sharpness, no clarity. Only something Reid had never seen before in his dog, a quiet surrender. Beautiful, peaceful. Reid pushed himself up despite the aching in every muscle. He reached across to the other bed, fingers brushing Cash's thin frame beneath a soft blanket. His flank had been shaved for monitoring, the skin wrinkled and pale beneath. "You," Reid whispered, voice cracking. "You haven't let go." Cash's eyes fluttered. No sharp movement, no instinctive reaction, just that final gaze, and within it the truth Reid had long refused to face. Cash had known long ago that Reid would survive. And he had chosen to stay, knowing the cost. "You've endured this pain." Reid breathed, leaning closer, until his forehead nearly touched the dog's, just so I could see one more sunrise. The doctor had once told him, organ pain is the cruelest kind. Not the kind that makes you scream, but the kind that drips through your body like sand through stone. Quiet, constant, breaking you inch by inch. And yet, Cash endured it, silently. Reid placed a hand on the dog's neck, not as a handler, not as a soldier, but as a friend, offering the last warmth he had left, holding on to something slipping away. "We made it home, Cash," he whispered, soft as dawn. "You kept your promise. You brought me back." Cash blinked one final time. His eyes didn't go dark. They simply closed. slowly, peacefully, like someone shutting the door on a journey, without regret, without hurry, without needing to be seen. Just content and stepping back. Reid didn't cry. He didn't have the strength, but he wrapped his arms around Cash's body, pulling him close to his chest. For the first time since the day he adopted him. And perhaps for the last. A nurse quietly stepped into the room to check the IV. Then she stopped, frozen in the doorway. 2 beds. One held a thin man-arms wrapped gently around the body of a dog. No sobs, no words. Just 2 living beings, one beginning to heal, the other quietly fading, sharing their final warmth. The nurse stepped away, without a sound, but left one note in the report. Second patient, Cash, closed his eyes in the arms of the man he chose to stay for. That morning, the sky above the military hospital turned a pale blue, strangely soft, as if a thin veil of mist had just lifted. The air felt still light and clear. Reid remained where he was, his hand slowly brushing through the fur around the dog's neck. He whispered something. No one could hear it, but perhaps that didn't matter. Only he and Cash would understand. Old stories, old battles, cold desert nights, moments they weren't supposed to survive, but did. All of it folded now into a goodbye spoken not with sound, but with the final meeting of eyes that had seen everything. A young soldier stepped quietly into the doorway. He didn't speak, just walked forward and pulled something from his pocket. A small tag, Cash's military ID. He placed it on the table next to a folded map. "Sir, we kept our promise. He didn't leave you. Not even at the end." Reid gave a slight nod. His hand still rested on Cash's body, still warm though the heart beneath had stilled. That night, the hospital halls sank into an unusual silence. In the yellow glowing corridors, only the soft footsteps of nurses remained and the steady beeping of machines from dimly lit rooms. Room 214, where the 2 beds stood side by side, kept a faint light on. One for the man who'd come back from the edge. One for the life quietly slipping into the light of the next dawn. At 0047, Cash's heart monitor flashed. Just once. The night nurse, so used to the gentle lull of the beeps, paused. A skipped beat. Then another. She checked again. His heart rate was slowing. Not gently, but like a candle whose flame had grown tired. She called for the on-duty doctor. The old man in the white coat came briskly, stethoscope and cuff in hand. But when he reached the bedside, he didn't touch the dog immediately. He looked at Reid. Reid was already awake. He hadn't needed to be told. "I know," he said quietly, eyes fixed on the dog, lying slightly curled beneath the blanket, nearly melted into the fabric. "We can take Cash to another unit," the doctor offered. "Give him oxygen. Maybe extend it just a little more." Reid shook his head. "Don't." Then, almost to himself, as if pulling from somewhere deep and raw, he said, "He never left me in the middle of anything. This last night, I want to be here with him." The doctor nodded like one receiving a command too sacred for rank. "We'll leave you here. If you need anything, just press the call button." Reid didn't respond. He was already turned toward Cash. "Just a little more time," he whispered. Nothing else. The door closed behind them. The night deepened. Cash lay on his side facing Reid. One ear drooped slightly, the other still tilted up, still listening. His body had quieted limbs, mostly still, but his nose twitched faintly with each breath like a drawn-out goodbye. Reid leaned in trembling hand, brushing the dog's neck. "Do you remember the first time I called your name?" he asked, lips cracked into a tired smile. "Cash, because your eyes were like an old coin buried in dust, still shining." Cash blinked. Once. A nod. And you never turned away? Reid continued, voice like a song sung only once. Not through smoke. Not through stone. Not even when I was lying 6 feet under in my own mind. You always came back. Cash drew in a deeper breath, like trying to capture the scent of the room of Reid, of the human who had become his entire world. Reid leaned closer, forehead nearly touching the soft spot between Cash's ears. His hand glided from brow to muzzle, still warm, still soft. Just like the first time he'd touched the wild dog no one believed could be tamed. You don't have to hold on anymore, Reid whispered. I'm alive. I'm safe now. You can rest. A long moment passed. Time itself seemed to still. Then slowly Cash lifted his head. No strain, no urgency. Just enough for his muzzle to rest inside Reid's waiting palm. The soldier's hand steadied. He cradled that head gently like something delicate and infinite. And then, Cash exhaled. A long, deep breath. The kind that empties everything. After that, only silence. No twitch, no gasp, no desperate motion, just no breath returning. Cash's eyes closed fully. His muzzle remained nestled in Reid's hand. One ear stayed slightly raised, still listening, still tracking, as if his mission required he follow until the very end. 01:33. The monitor released one last tone, a long one. The line flattened. The nurse came to the door and stopped. She looked through the window but didn't enter. Inside, Reid sat perfectly still. His hands cradled Cash's head. His eyes didn't weep, but they held a whole sky that had just lost its last star. You were my compass, he whispered. When every signal was gone. The voice I heard, even in hell. The nurse entered quietly. Reid glanced up and shook his head. No procedures, no revivals. She nodded, retrieving a soft white cloth. She draped it gently over Cash's body, but left the head resting in Reid's arms. You can stay as long as you need, she said, voice damp with tears, but steady in kindness. Reid didn't respond. He only murmured to no one but the soul still echoing through his ribs. Tonight, there'll be no barking, but I'll still hear you, in my heart. 1 week after Cash's passing, the small garden behind the hospital administration wing was cleared and lined with fresh grass. There were no rows of honor chairs, no brass trumpet ceremonies. The memorial was quiet, fitting for the one it honored, humble, steadfast, never seeking praise. In the center stood a small wooden table. On it, a single framed photo of Cash, taken just after his first mission. His eyes looked straight ahead, ears alert, fur still dusty. Beside it lay a worn black fabric tag with his metal ID edges slightly frayed. In front, a hand-painted wooden sign read, Cash, a comrade without rank who carried an entire front line in his heart. Reid had arrived early. He sat in the last row, shirt, simple left arm still bandaged. Everyone saw him, but no one called out. No one tried to speak. They all understood. Some pain doesn't need to be spoken. It only needs to be acknowledged. A senior officer stepped forward to speak. He recounted Cash's journey, from a stray dog in a war zone to a recognized K-9 partner across 3 different divisions. The undocumented missions, the wounds never recorded in medical files, the actions carried out without command, and yet never once absent. The wind rustled through the pine trees behind him, the leaves whispering as if echoing every pause in his voice. The officer faltered, his eyes reddening. We never got to say thank you. All we knew was, whenever we thought we'd lost someone, Cash was the reason we still held on to hope. Next, a representative from the medical unit stepped up. An older doctor placed a hand over his chest and paused a moment before speaking. The first time I met Cash, I thought my job was to keep Reid alive. But it turned out, Cash had already done that. Through his eyes, his presence. Through a heart that slowed its beat just enough to keep one more soul tethered to this world. The garden fell utterly silent. No one moved. No one raised a camera. No military honors were performed. For Cash had never worn a uniform. Yet in that silence, they all knew a full and solemn memorial had taken place, built entirely from quiet gratitude. Reid was invited to speak. He quietly shook his head. Instead, he walked forward, gripping something in his hand, a worn-out tag that once hung from Cash's collar. The fabric still carried the scent of smoke and dirt. It hadn't been washed. It hadn't been polished. Reid stepped to the memorial table. He didn't bow. He didn't cry. He simply reached up and clipped the tag beside another, an old faded brass one that read, J. Bennett, 2007. A fallen comrade from a long-ago mission. No one asked why he placed them side by side. But they all understood in his own way. Cash had walked with Reid through the long silence left by the friends who never came back. Cash's photo was hung between the two tags, like a bridge between past and present. Reid stood still for a long moment. Then he turned and walked away without saying a word. That evening, someone spotted Reid sitting alone on the back steps of the hospital. Around his neck hung a third tag. No number, no engraved name. Just a handwritten line, barely legible in faded ink. You don't need to speak. Just stay. A photo was taken, shared only within the unit. It spread quickly, but no one dared make it public. They knew it belonged to just one man, and a dog already gone. Later, when asked about Cash, Reid offered only a single sentence. He left the same way he lived, without asking for anything, without making a sound. We just regret not saying thank you in time. The early September wind swept through the Colorado highlands, cool and dry as the sun lost its heat, but still painted the dirt paths golden beside the outer fence. Life on base returned to its usual rhythm: patrol rotations, signal transmissions, marked up maps, and boots echoing across the yard. Reid came back on a quiet morning. Unannounced, no escort, no formal welcome, and no one called his name. But when his silhouette appeared under the soft morning sky, everyone knew. He had returned, though something in him hadn't. He carried a small backpack, a few notebooks, and a key ring clipped to his chest pocket. The silver tag of Cash brushing against his chest with every step. No one asked. No one needed to. In Reid's eyes still lingered the shadow of a partner who hadn't made it home. That first day back, Reid said little. He walked past the old K9 kennels, where Cash once had his own room. Kennel number 7. Beside it, the patch of ground where Cash used to growl softly every morning when strangers passed. The gate stood open now. The space inside was clean but empty. No lingering scent, no shed fur, no soft scratch of paws against the door. Reid stood there for a long time. Then he opened his pack and pulled out a small tin bowl. One side was dented, a scar from hundreds of rushed meals between missions. He placed it right beneath the wooden bench where Cash used to wait, always watching him, even when he was just flipping through a field journal. Then, as if following a habit that never died, Reid opened his ration pouch, took out a small portion, and placed it in the bowl. "Do you think he's coming back?" a young soldier asked, hesitant, as he passed by. Reid didn't look up. His hands carefully folded the rest of the ration pack. "No," he replied softly. "I'm not waiting for him." The young man stood quietly. Then Reid added, his eyes still on the bowl. "But that spot used to be his, and I'm still here. So every morning I leave it out for him, not because I expect him, but because I remember it used to be full." For weeks after every morning at 06 Hero, anyone passing Kennel 7 would see the same tin bowl beneath the bench with a few dry biscuits inside. No one touched it, no one asked. Because everyone who had fought beside Reid, who had seen Cash leap into the ravine to pull his partner back, who had seen those unwavering eyes until the last second. They all knew that space couldn't be left empty. One day, Reid was assigned a short patrol along the border to check a signal relay. Before leaving, he left the same portion of food in the bowl. It rained while he was gone. Leaves blew into the kennel. Wind slapped at his soaked jacket. But when he returned, he saw the food untouched, only damp with rain. He didn't pick it up. He simply stepped closer, pulled a cloth from his pocket, gently wiped the bowl clean, and placed another fresh portion inside. "If he were still here today," Reid whispered, "I know the rain wouldn't stop him. Only the thought that I'd forgotten might." Later, when the base underwent upgrades, there was a plan to remove the old kennels to build a new supply depot. Most of the paperwork had been approved, except for one final signature. Reid's. He sat in front of the blueprint, eyes fixed on the section labeled Kennel 7. Then slowly he picked up a pen and marked a short line under the diagram. Not big, not bold, but clear enough for all to read, "Preserve Kennel 7. Do not repurpose. That's a place of remembrance." No one objected. The base kept expanding, but the kennel row remained untouched, preserved like a small memorial. On kennel number 7, a small brass plaque had been mounted. "Still here for breakfast." Reid passed by it every day. Sometimes his hand would brush lightly across the plaque, never to wipe off the dust or polish the shine. He let time do its quiet work, etching memory into the weathered grain of wood, the same way Cash once left paw prints around the chair where Reid used to sit. And every morning, whether it rained or blazed with sun, the meal was there, neatly arranged, untouched whole. That day the wind came differently, one of those thin, silent breezes that only visit when September quietly passes the torch to October. It wasn't strong enough to scatter dry leaves, but it chilled the bones if you stood still too long. The air felt thick with something unnamed, and those at the base couldn't shake the feeling. Something was coming. A young soldier from the Southern Patrol returned early dusk still clinging to his face. He stepped into the supply room hesitant, then stopped in front of Reid's desk. "Sir, this afternoon on patrol near the old clearing, I think I saw a dog." Reid looked up. "A dog, yes, sir. It wasn't moving, just standing there right in the open. Didn't bark, didn't run, but it stared right at the base for a long time. Then it was gone." Reid stayed silent. It wasn't the first time. Over the past weeks, others had whispered of a gray-brown shape glimpsed at dawn or dusk, only to vanish like wind brushing through grass. He said nothing, just stood, pulled on his coat, and whispered, "Just once more. Let me see him once more." The path to the old training grounds wasn't far, but it was littered with potholes and jagged stone. That field had once been a place of noise and command, where Cash learned to track, leap, respond. Now it was nothing but cracked dirt and high weeds with rusting iron stakes poking through brittle brush. Reid stopped short of the clearing. No flashlight, no weapon, no name called into the dusk, just one man and the breath of wind against low trees. He walked deeper in. Every step landed on a memory. There, where Cash used to sit waiting for his signal. There, where he'd launched himself to stop a soldier from stepping on a training mine. Every inch of this land still bore a trace. But something felt different this time. The wind held still. The air seemed to draw in. And in the center of the clearing, lit faintly by the last golden light of day, Reid saw it. Not a dog, not even a sound, but a circle in the grass, pressed low in a perfect arc. Something had been sitting there. Reid didn't move. He stared for a long moment, then slowly stepped forward. Beneath the dust, there were shallow prints, faint but deep enough, old but undeniable, and near the edge a thin smear of rust brown, no longer fresh, dried by the sun. Blood. He knelt, touched the dried stain, no warmth left, but the shape was familiar, a front paw lightly pressed. The breeze stirred again, not loud, just enough to make Reid shiver. He looked around, but no voice left his throat, just a knot of dust and memory caught behind it. And inside him, moments came rushing back. The soft scrape of claws at midnight, the press of warm fur against his hand, Cash's final look, that exhale when he rested his gaze on Reid's fingers. And now, in this forgotten stretch of dry earth, tracks remained. "You came," Reid whispered, lowering himself closer to the ground. "You're still watching here." He didn't clean the blood, didn't erase the prints, didn't call anyone over. He only reached into his pocket, took out a folded scrap of cloth, wiped the dirt beside the paw mark clean. Then he pulled a charcoal pencil from his coat, wrote slowly onto a piece of wood, and stood it gently in the earth. "I know you came back, not to await orders, but to remind me someone still guards the wind." That night, Reid returned home quietly. And during dinner, though no words were said, people noticed. He kept glancing toward the door, toward the familiar spot beneath the chair. No one spoke when they saw it. The bowl was empty. At dawn, while dew still hung on the rusted tin rooftop, Reid unlatched the personal storage trunk that had remained sealed since the final month of their last campaign. Everything was still there. Neatly packed rolls of medical gauze, creased border maps, an emergency needle kit, and a small moss-colored notebook, its corner chewed off. Reid smiled. That bite mark was Cash's, left one night when Reid had forgotten the notebook on his chair. When he came back, Cash sat beside it, bits of paper still on his muzzle, his eyes asking, "What did you forget this time?" Since that night, the notebook had become sacred. Not for what was written in it, but for that trace, a trace of life that had once shadowed his every step through the chaos of war. He flipped the pages. Ink had faded, some words blurred, mostly notes, coordinates, numbers. But in between all that, there were moments. Unassigned, uncommanded, unwritten for duty, just memories quietly kept. He paused at a pencil-written line scrawled unevenly. "Cash is quieter than anyone, but I've never lost my way with him." Reid read it again, fingers pressed gently against the page. Those smoke-heavy nights came back. When signals failed, maps were useless, and only Cash walked ahead, steady steps, like a beacon across the unknown. He sat still for a long time, then took a fresh pen from his coat, and beneath that old line slowly wrote, "I'm still alive," which means you're still guarding. Outside sunlight crept down the porch tiles, toward the spot where the morning bowl used to be. But today, for the first time in weeks, Reid didn't set the bowl out. Instead, he placed the notebook, left open at the page he had just written, face down on the warm stone. Not for anyone to read. Just a way of saying, "I know you're close, and I'm still writing each beat you left behind." That afternoon, a young soldier passed by intending to ask Reid about the briefing. But he froze, watching the man on the porch sitting still, holding the empty bowl, his eyes lost somewhere far beyond the gate. The soldier asked softly, "So, there's no portion left for him tonight?" Reid shook his head. No need. He lifted his bowl, tapped it 3 times, gently against the ground, the way one might knock on a familiar door before entering, then whispered, "He never missed a shift. I've only just realized I was the one being relieved." That night, Reid brought the notebook upstairs and placed it beside his pillow. He opened it again, not to write, but to feel each page that once pressed against his uniform, soaked in sweat and carried the scent of border soil. A dream came quietly, not of clear images, but of warmth by his side. And in that dream, he heard a steady breath, just like the countless nights before when a silent figure lay close unmoving, yet filling the room with presence. The next morning, the cleaning staff found a slip of paper tucked inside the notebook, still in Reid's handwriting, freshly written the night before. "If I lose my way again, please walk ahead. You don't need to look back. I'll always know you by the tracks that never waver." November arrived quietly, bringing a chill sharp enough to require an extra layer outdoors, but not enough to freeze what continued to flow beneath the surface. Reid's room became a quiet endpoint to each day, a space no one knocked on unless it was truly urgent. His closest comrades understood someone else resided there too, unseen but never absent. By the window sat a small tin box. It didn't hold tools nor metals. Inside were letters. Reid had started writing after the memorial. No schedule, no templates, no envelopes. Just lined sheets, sometimes stained with ink, sometimes just a few words, and on some nights, page after page of slanted handwriting. Each one began the same: "Dear Cash." He wrote the words he'd never spoken during their missions. He wrote about the fear of waking up without Cash curled at his feet, about that familiar sigh after each exhausting training, about the very first time he gave a name to a soul he never expected to keep for so long. One letter held a single line: "You did better than any soldier I've ever known." Another he wrote until the ink ran dry halfway through: "If there's a next life, let me be your guard." Every time he finished, Reid folded the letter neatly and placed it inside the box. He didn't seal it, didn't send it. He told himself, these letters don't need a destination. They only need to exist, because the one they're for never really left. One night, while organizing expired supplies in the old logistics room, a young soldier found a yellowed notebook in a forgotten drawer. A page slipped out. On it, Reid's clear handwriting: "If I never got the chance to thank you, then let me keep repeating this. I'm still alive. So that means you're still on watch." The soldier didn't keep it, didn't take it. He simply placed it back, closed the drawer, as if preserving a fragment of something deeply true. A loyalty without leash, a promise that never needed words. From then on, people began to refer to Reid as the man who writes letters he never sends. But no one mocked him. No one joked. Instead, whenever someone felt lost, they would glance toward the room at the end of the hall. The one with the desk light glowing each night, and a man still writing to a spirit not found on any roster. Reid never reread what he wrote, but each time he opened the box, he would touch each folded note gently, as if it were a morning greeting, or a farewell exchanged during an invisible shift, guarded still by Cash on the other side of every distance. Once he copied the final line of his 30th letter onto the back of his dog tag: "If another life exists, I'll be the one holding the leash, standing beside you, letting no one disturb the sleep of the one who kept my whole life safe." Winter was approaching. Outside the window, the wind picked up. Leaves blanketed the courtyard, but inside the room, the fountain pen still moved steadily. Reid wrote, not to cling to memories, but as if each word was a breath extending a bond that had never frayed. And in that fleeting moment, when the pen lifted from paper, he looked up toward the window. A breeze slipped in, like an answer. By late December, snow had begun to fall gently over the highlands. The first flurries light as dust blanketed the grass and rooftops of the outpost. Amid the cold of early winter, the command office remained lit through the night, partly for transmission logs, partly for the final meeting of the Civilian Special Ops Unit. The event was officially titled Closure Record, Operation Colorado Code 74 Delta. On the table lay a thick dossier: logs, results, casualties, names of withdrawn personnel. And at the very end, In red ink, asset decommissioned K9 cash, perished in the line of duty. The room fell silent as the quartermaster read those words aloud. Slow nods, quiet glances. But no one spoke. No moment of silence, no ceremony, just a quiet acknowledgement. Exactly the way Cash had walked with them since the very beginning. As the others left, Reid remained seated. He hadn't spoken during the meeting, his eyes fixed on the roster printed in bold. Each name had a number, a unit, a date in, and a date out. Cash's row had no code, just 2 words, teammate. An old logistics officer approached, carrying a small black fabric pouch. He set it on the table. From it, he pulled out a worn wide-duty collar, faded, frayed at the edges. "This is all that's left," the man said quietly. "By protocol, it should go to storage. But if you'd prefer," Reid raised a hand, gently stopping the man's words. "Let me keep it," he said, eyes still fixed on the collar. "I'm not keeping it as a personal memento. I want it to be used so that future K9 recruits know. A life once wore this and never stepped back." The old officer gave a small nod, his hand trembling slightly as he pushed the collar toward Reid. That night, Reid brought the collar back to his room. He cleaned each buckle, carefully removed the old tracking chip, then attached a small metal tag. It bore no name, only the unit insignia, and a faintly engraved line, "Guard to the end." The next morning, he took it to the civilian K9 training center, where young pups were just beginning the harsh program that would shape them into borderland guardians. In the first training room, he stepped inside, surrounded by clumsy paws and bright eyes digging in the sand. Reid placed the collar on a wooden mount at the center of the room, then turned to the head trainer and said, "Don't store it away. Let it hang here, so that these lives just beginning will understand. If one day they're chosen to wear it, they'll carry the memory of those who once stood firm against the wind." From that day on, every K9 generation was led through that room on their first day. And though none of the pups could fully understand, they were told the story of a dog who once wore that collar, who crossed fog and stone, who pulled a man from the earth and never moved again, until the final breath. Something always lingered. Each time a new pup received its first training collar, the trainer would kneel down and say, "This one's a copy. The original still waits there until one of you is brave enough to wear it again." Reid never returned to base after that handover. He walked a long stretch across a bare lot where old paw prints had once faded into the wind, then stopped at a weathered pine behind the hill. There he placed a small engraved plate at the roots, "K9 cash. Mission complete. Guard transferred." That evening, back in his room, Reid opened the old notebook for the first time in months. He flipped to the final page and wrote, "The final report isn't stored in any file. It lives in the eyes of those who survived, because a dog once turned back." Then he closed the notebook and placed it on his desk just below the key hook holding the dog tag, its lettering long worn away. A breeze passed through the open window, soft enough to mimic the sound of claws brushing gently across cement. Reid smiled. Tonight's watch was still manned. The house at the end of Oak Ridge Street was nothing remarkable. Brown shingles, gray brick walls, a window that opened into a backyard of weeds and a single rosemary bush. The neighbors called it the place where the retired special ops guy lives alone, but few knew the man's real name was Reid, or that someone else had once lived there too, without ever needing to speak. The living room was modest. No medals on display, no framed photos. But there was one thing everyone noticed: the old gray rug in the corner by the fireplace. The rug was worn, its edges frayed with a few threadbare spots that looked like scratch marks from long ago. Outsiders might assume it was forgotten or awaiting replacement. But to Reid, it was immovable. That was where Cash had lain every night. Head resting gently on his foot, eyes half-closed, ears always tilted toward the world. Years had passed since Cash was gone. Reid still lived alone. He never adopted another dog, never rearranged the room, never let anyone clean that corner. Every morning he placed a small bowl of water beside the rug, not full, never explained. Just habit. A quiet signal. There's still a space here for you. At night, when the hallway light clicked off and the room filled with the soft glow of a bedside lamp, the curtain would sometimes shift. Barely. And every time Reid would glance back, eyes narrowing slightly as if searching for something just passing by. Each time, he smiled. One evening, a visitor arrived, an old comrade now retired and teaching at the K9 training center. They hadn't sat long before the guest looked toward the fireplace corner and asked, "You still keep it the same?" Reid nodded. "Yeah, even if he's gone that spot. Someone still lies there." The man chuckled quietly, eyes misted. New recruits hear about Cash and think he's just a legend. But I tell them, legends don't need to be exaggerated. Just remembered, the right way. After tea, the guest left early. Reid walked him to the door. As he returned inside, the curtain stirred again. Not harsh like a breeze, but more like someone had brushed gently past. He didn't draw them closed, didn't lock the door. Instead, he walked to the rug, sat down, laid a hand beside the bowl, still warm, and whispered as if greeting a soldier back from patrol, "The wind's soft tonight, but I know you passed through. Thank you." Then he stood, fell back into habit, opened the drawer, pulled out the old notebook, its corners still bearing faint tooth marks. On today's page, he wrote only one sentence: "This room is quiet enough to hear old footsteps passing by." One winter morning, snow blanketed the path, and the postman arrived with a parcel from the K9 training center. Inside was a photo journal of this year's recruits, each pup photographed with a collar modeled after Cash's. Behind them, always the same plaque, "Guard Onward." Reid flipped through, slowly smiling at the familiar expressions. Each dog unique, yet all with that same attentive gaze, that bowed head awaiting instruction, that still patience, and above all, that silent fidelity. He placed the album gently in the drawer just below the old steel bowl, now polished and used to hold handwritten slips of paper. One had been there for years. Its ink remained clear. "If another life exists, let me be the one who guards yours." Night fell. Snow thickened quietly outside. In the room, the soft lamp cast light onto the rug, its outline still pressed faintly, as though someone lay there every night without fail. Reid sat at the desk, closed the notebook, and returned it to the familiar shelf. Then he looked toward the curtain, still swaying gently, not from the wind, but from a memory that never left. On a late winter morning, when the wind felt as thin as a thread and the sunlight was just warm enough to melt the ice on the front steps, Reid sat once more at his desk, the old wooden one by the east-facing window. On its surface, aside from a steaming cup of tea, there was only a thick cloth-bound notebook, brand new with soft ivory pages. Beneath the cover, a line had been carefully handwritten: "Cash, the one who stayed." It wasn't a memoir, nor was it an after-action report. It was a remembrance, not written to glorify, nor to be preserved for others. But because there are things which, if never placed into words, slowly slip into the past, even though they've never truly left. Reid began from the beginning. The first day he met that dog in a combat zone, when it was nothing more than a wild silhouette, ribs showing eyes like worn coins glinting in the red dust. The first time he gave it a name, Cash, because he shone like something old, but still full of worth. He wrote about those early days of training when Cash never followed commands, but always stayed beside him. About the night shifts where a single glance was clearer than any signal. He wrote about the time Cash dashed through a rock crevice, grabbed onto his jacket in the collapsed mine shaft, and stayed by his side, injured but unmoving. And he wrote about the final day, when Cash let out a deep breath, muzzle resting on Reid's hand, and closed his eyes, as if he had nothing left to regret. Every detail was written in a calm, unembellished tone. No dramatization, no lamentation. Just truth, like a bell that continued to ring deep within memory. When Reid reached the final page, he paused for a long time. Morning light filtered across the table, slipping between the folds of the pages. He turned back to the beginning. Those first lines were still fresh, the strokes steady and neat. But as he flipped forward, the handwriting thickened, the ink pressed deeper, as if each word had grown heavier under the weight of feeling. He took a deep breath and wrote on the last page. No title, no date. Some lives don't need training. They just need to be trusted. And once you trust them, they'll carry your life, your soul, and your memory for you. His name was Cash, and I am still living on the strength of that trust. When the final line was done, Reid set the pen down, his hand resting on the paper's edge, as if honoring a vow that had just been signed. The next day, he brought the notebook to the military library, where records of survival were quietly kept by those who had endured. He didn't make an appointment. He simply walked to the librarian's desk, placed the notebook down, and said, "There's no need for a table of contents. Just place it where people can see it when they walk in." The librarian read the name on the cover, stood silent for a few moments, then nodded and accepted it. No questions were asked. The notebook was placed gently into a small glass display near the entrance. Below it, a brass plaque was etched, author, former Special Ops Officer Reid, about a warrior with no rank who carried an entire generation. From that day on, during the first K-9 training cycle each year, instructors would bring new trainees to that same glass case point to the notebook and speak with quiet certainty. There was once a dog named Cash. He didn't need to bark. He only needed to be there. And that was enough to save lives. Reid never returned to the library, but every morning as he rose from bed, his eyes would glance toward the rug in the corner, the one now illuminated by sunlight through the blinds, revealing faint impressions in the fabric, as if the shape that once rested there still lingered. He still lived alone, but he was no longer lonely, because in every breath, every step, and every word he had written, Cash was still there. Some stories don't need an ending because they are themselves a journey, stretched across memory, across glances, across trust. The story of Reid and Cash wasn't just the memory of a soldier and the dog who had crossed the front line with him. It was a living proof of a bond that rose above all training, absolute trust. The German Shepherd, a breed known for its loyalty, intelligence, and quiet bravery, appears not just in rescue missions or elite operations. They live in the everyday moments, the quiet companionship, the unspoken understanding. They are reflections of the purest dedication, of silent empathy, and of the unwavering will to protect without needing to be asked.